For those who've been watching for a while, you know we've been beating around the bush for a good couple of years now. So I think it's time we got right to the issue of where do coffee prices come from? It's a really complex topic, so we're going to break it up into 4 parts for now. And more than likely, we'll come back to it in other videos to look at other specific aspects. So when we talk about the coffee price, which price are we even referring to? I often hear about the price as if it's some kind of a mystical being, a force of nature. And in the world of Arabica coffee, the most common one that people look to is the C price. But why is that the price? Who says it is? We need to separate the different notions of price and the theories and concepts that each one rely on. We need to separate the pricing indicators that exist and are communicated to us from the notion of an equilibrium price that clears the market of all supply and demand, and the prices paid in actual individual transactions. These 3 notions are sometimes confused, and we really need to sort them out before we can move forward. Just to get ourselves into context, let's have a look at this graphic here, which are real prices of coffee from 1995 to 2021. Here you can see the black line at the top that is the roasted coffee price. When I say that these are real prices, that means that they are deflated or adjusted based on the cost of other things, so that the same amount of purchasing power is represented. So along this time series, these aren't the actual amounts of currency that were paid for these things. Rather, it's the amount of currency based on the value of $1 at one point in time. The reason we do this is so that along this time series, from 1995 to 2021, the prices represent what can be purchased with them, which is constant from beginning to end. When we are comparing the incentives that people have, which is to make money, and money is used to buy things, it makes more sense to do it this way. Because the incentive to do something to earn 1 unit of currency based on what we think that will purchase, what we need in our day-to-day lives, or what we need to make other things with, is constant. So the black line at the top here is the roasted coffee price. We can see that this generally trends upward based on the dotted line, which is the linear trend from beginning to end. Naturally, the retail price is the highest price because all of the prior prices paid previous along the chain have to come out of this price. This is the last transaction that happens, so it makes sense that someone who's buying something is going to sell it for more, not less than what they paid for it. Below the black line, we have the red line, which is the non-mild coffee price, the green line, which is the mild coffee price, and the blue line in between them, that is the New York C price. Mild coffee is, of course, washed Arabica, and non-mild coffee includes hard Arabica, which is normally a natural or pulp natural process or something like this, as well as Robusta coffee. What's interesting to notice in this graph is that near the beginning, from 1995 until about 2005, the blue and the green lines are very close together. That means that the price of mild coffee that was actually sold and exported, the price was very close to the New York C price. Whereas after about 2005, these lines begin to drift apart from one another, meaning the price that people are actually paying in the spot market for physical mild Arabica coffee starts to grow with respect to the New York C price. And in relative terms, the red line for non-mild coffee gets a bit close to the blue line. We're going to come back and talk a lot about these individual prices and the transactions of one type of coffee versus another when we talk about differentials. But for now, let's really focus on the notion of where the prices come from. So if we're asking about prices, we're probably buying or selling something, or else perhaps we wouldn't really care what they are. And if we are involved in buying or selling coffee, the only price that really matters is the price of our transaction, the price that we're selling for or buying for. The only real prices are prices that have been paid by someone to someone else for something in the past. Aside from these, everything else is an indicator, a prediction, an average of the past, meant to indicate something about the future. And as such, this is only relevant in that we believe in it. So if what we really care about is the transaction price, where do we think this comes from? There are quite a lot of ways to think about this, about where transaction prices and market prices come from, but just in order to open our minds toward different notions of prices a bit, let's separate this into a couple of categories. Let's say that the price of our transaction could come from free negotiation or from an institutional reference. If a transaction price is derived from free negotiation, it could be determined by market forces, in which case both buyer and seller are price takers, meaning no one has power over one another, and the invisible hand in a perfectly efficient market is dictating the price that everyone pays, because that's the price that clears the market. On the other hand, if we're not in a perfectly efficient market, it could be the relative power of the buyer versus the seller that determines the price of the transaction. In that case, one party is the price maker and the other party is the price taker. This would represent a situation of imperfect competition. On the other hand, if this is not a free negotiation that determines the price, there could be an institutional reference. This could be formal, such as when governments or some other authority says that this is the price of today, or this is the minimum price of today, or in some cases, this is the price of this year. This could be a formal law or other type of regulation, and these kind of references tend to be determined through a political process. There are also informal references, which are only valid based on a consensus of power that they should be important. In that sense, these are also political processes. An example of this would be the ICO, the International Coffee Organization, which publishes price references every day. They cannot obligate anyone to sell for or buy for these prices. However, the actual prices of coffee bought and sold every day is extremely highly correlated with these. Therefore, their validity is based on a consensus that they are appropriate prices for physical coffee. So let's talk about another notion of price, and that's the market price. So the market price is the going rate. It's the price of alternatives. That if I were to go out into the market, whatever that is, that's the price that I would be able to find. Say you and I are negotiating some coffee, and you don't like the price that I'm offering. You might say, well, the market price is above. But what you're implying is that you could go somewhere else and sell to someone else, and they would pay you a different price, whatever you think the market price is. So if the market price is the price of alternatives, where do these alternatives come from? Why are they priced the way they are? This is where the discussion of pricing becomes theoretical. It depends if we have a situation of perfect competition, or the complete opposite, a monopoly or monopsony. Or perhaps we're somewhere in between in a market of imperfect competition, without being a complete monopoly or monopsony. Just a side note, a monopoly, which you may be familiar with from the board game, is when there's a single seller. That seller determines the price. They often will determine the profit maximizing price, which is not the highest price. And because there is no competition, they can do that. A monopsony will be the inverse. So there's a single buyer and many sellers that rely on this buyer, so they can set their own purchase price, meaning that they can control the income of whoever's selling to them. So under perfect competition, as I mentioned a moment ago, we have an automatic equilibrium price. So based on the forces of supply and demand, the price will converge to that perfect spot where supply cancels demand, no product is left over, everything is sold, everyone who's able and willing to purchase at that price purchases it, and no one is left with none with money in their hand. In a monopoly or monopsony, the monopolist or monopsonist is able to set the price where it maximizes profits for them. Of course, if you're a monopsonist, you have all the market power as a buyer, you could set the price at zero. But that probably wouldn't maximize your profits, because people would just stop producing the thing that you want to buy from them. Likewise, if you're a monopsonist, you could set the price at infinity or something outrageously high. But of course, if no one is physically able to pay it, then it will not maximize your profits. So you'll figure out how to set the price at just such a level where the quantity you're able to sell and the margin you earn for that quantity maximizes your total profit. And in the middle, where we have imperfect competition, this is not a perfect situation where there is no price maker and no price taker. Rather, there is power to influence where it's a price, but it's not unilateral power like in the case of a monopoly or monopsony. Rather, the price is set based on a consensus of power and considering a certain level of competition that exists, which is likely greater on one side of the transaction than on the other. Then, regardless of the competitiveness of this market or how this market price is determined, whatever the dominant regime is, it could be protected through an institution, be it formal or informal. An institution, again, in this context, is not necessarily a government authority or something like this. Rather, it's any kind of formal or informal rules of the game, such as price references from a futures market, from a nonprofit organization, or from governments themselves. So when we talk about the price of alternatives, this gets into the discussion of market power and bargaining power, which we cover in other videos and I won't get too far into right now. But when we say that there are different alternatives, we can think about two extremes. We can have an auction where there is competition among buyers to get something that's very scarce, and they are offering better and better prices until the other ones can't do it anymore and they can get this thing. Or we could have the opposite of a fire sale, where anyone is just coming up and offering any price because the most important thing is to get rid of everything. So as in the graphic here, we could have a situation where there's one single buyer, a monopsonist, this very big face here, and they only need 5 very small sellers. But say there are like 40 sellers, they only need 5 of them. That makes each one substitutable with all the other ones. And if all of them need a buyer, well, then the buyer has quite a lot of power to make sure that they get the best deal that any of those 20, 30, whatever is able to offer. So just as in the auction metaphor, where the sale price is the highest price that any buyer is willing to offer, the opposite could just as easily be true. The sale price could be the lowest that any of the potential sellers are willing to accept. And this all comes down to the relative power of buyers versus sellers. The alternatives that are available may be different for buyers versus sellers. Perhaps coffee buyers have trucks and they can go to towns all over the country and find the coffee they need at the best price that they can find. Whereas sellers don't have trucks and they have coffee which is big and heavy. They can only go to one town. So whatever buyers are there, that's what they have. Whereas the buyers, if they don't like any of the deals that they're getting, well, they can just leave and go to another town and find a better one. So this has to do with access, with resources, with information. Because perhaps coffee farmers in one town, they don't know the prices that are being paid in the next town over. The buyers, they may know this. That gives them potential alternatives. So now let's add these price references into the mix. The common price references in coffee that I see a lot of the time are the C price or the KC future contract of the subsequent expiration. Tenderable against this contract is mild Arabica coffee, washed coffee. There's also the RC contract for Robusta coffee. There are the ICO indicators, which are highly correlated with the C price, as we'll see in the next video here. And these apply to the different types of coffee that they define, which are Colombian milds, other milds, Brazilian naturals, and Robustas. In addition to these, there are a lot of national indicators. Some of these are based on the other indicators I mentioned to a greater or lesser degree. So we need to understand the connection between these price references, the market price, and this notion of an equilibrium price, the correct or fair price, which is the one that clears the market of all supply and demand. So these indicator or reference prices are often the same as the market price because this is signaling to the market, this is what you should be paying or charging for coffee. And it's often assumed that these are also equivalent to the equilibrium price. In fact, I was just reading a study today that compared the movements of the C price and the actual price at which coffee is bought and sold, which we saw in the first graphic of this video, and concluded that there is an efficient market and this price should represent equilibrium because they are so highly correlated that they must be based on the same market information. However, I think this connection between these three is somewhat circular because there's no reason that one couldn't simply be caused by the other. Market prices could very well be caused by price references, creating a correlation between the two, whether or not this price is representative of the equilibrium of supply and demand. These price references and their connection to the market price, of the price of coffee actually bought and sold, creates a kind of illusion of objectivity. Whereas the social processes that form these price references may not be objective at all. Come to think of it, I think there might be a meme in there somewhere. This is a prime example of what I call finance bro economics. And by that I mean a mechanical focus on the superficial data, but failing to recognize that economic actors are human beings. And therefore, in order to understand what's really going on, we must seek to understand the social processes that create the economic data that we have to study. So let's move on to the notion of market efficiency before we close out today. This is a big topic I've tried to deal with a little bit before in past videos, which I'll link here. And I'm sure we're going to have to explore a bit more, but it's somewhat dry, so I'm just going to go quickly for today. So in a theoretical efficient market where there's a theoretical market clearing price, this means that the quantity produced minus the quantity purchased results in zero. The market is cleared. There is no excess supply that cannot be sold, and there's no one left with money in their hand waiting to purchase and cannot do it. Because if at a certain price there is more supply than there is demand, well, the price must fall until the point where people say, okay, well, at that price, I'll have a little bit more. Or people that say before, I can't afford that price, they say, oh, at that price, I can afford. So they enter the market again and purchase until the supply is finished. This relies on price theory, meaning that there is a declining demand curve. So the lower the price, the more of something people will want. It makes sense. It's not true all the time, of course. And the inverse is also true. If there's an upward sloping supply curve, if at the current price there's more demand than there is supply, well, the price must rise until either sellers say, oh, well, at that price, I will find some more for you. Or some buyers will say, oh, at that price, I'll buy a little bit less, or might decide not to buy altogether. I think I've explained something like this before, and this is a perfect hypothetical situation, which in the real world is highly unlikely to ever exist. It makes certain assumptions that at least in the coffee market, and in almost all markets, if not all of them, are very unlikely to ever occur. So in this kind of a situation, all the buyers and sellers must have access to one another. In order to ensure that all supply is absorbed by buyers, well, all of those buyers have to know where it is and how to find it. All buyers and all sellers have to be able to transact with one another. They all must know each other's prices. Because if one seller is charging very high price, at which no buyer wants to buy their coffee, and another is selling at a very low price, in which many buyers would be happy to have it, well, they're going to have all of it, and then there's going to be none, and they're going to be left wanting more that doesn't exist. And the other side, there's going to be an excess supply that no one is going to buy because not everyone knows each other's prices in order to arrive at that equilibrium position where the market clears. This implies that all buyers and sellers are price takers. No one has the ability to influence or dictate price. Very importantly, it assumes that all supply and all demand is homogeneous. Any buyer and any seller can connect with one another and they can do a transaction at the equilibrium price, and they will be equally happy dealing with one another regardless of the identity of one or the other. Of course, we know that that's not true because all coffee is a bit different. There's a very wide spectrum of qualities even among commercial grades. So this is a pleasant notion. It looks nice in textbooks, but it is of course not realistic in the real world. So the question becomes, is the C price or whatever reference or whatever price reference we're dealing with equivalent to the equilibrium? In a real world with heterogeneous buyers and heterogeneous products, there will be many different supply and demand curves with different slopes and arcs based on the unique interests and capacities of every individual in the market. We know that there is not perfect competition because some actors in this market are more substitutable than others. Some experience more urgency than others, which are sources of power. Information is not perfect because some actors operate in different places all over the world. Others have very little contact with those outside of their village. And we know that real individuals in the world are not perfect utility and profit maximizers. Or at best, we know that the notion of utility depends on the personality of the person involved. So these were a few ideas which I hope have challenged your common sense notions of what are market prices, where they come from, and why they would or wouldn't reflect efficient markets. In the next one, we're going to take a deep look into commodities exchanges and derivatives and what these have to do with the prices that are actually being paid and earned by coffee buyers and sellers. See you there.